Yeah, very warm welcome, everybody, to this new open lecture hall. Another lecture in our series, Stockholm Plus 50, 5 Decades of Global Environmental Governance. My name is Lena Patsch. I'm Professor of Comparative Politics at the Otto Suhr Institute. And I organized this public lecture series together with several students to take stock of, by now, 5 decades of global environmental governance. And today, the lecture deals with something actually non-environmental, quite the opposite of environmentalism. This lecture today is about economic growth, and with SDG 8, Sustainable Development Goal number 8, the international community still strives for economic growth despite criticism from environmentalists. So it's very nice to have you here with us, Ekaterina Chertkovskaya. She will outline today this debate for us on economic growth and especially from an environmental perspective. Ekaterina, before the floor is yours, we will introduce you. Then your talk lasts for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. People here in the WebEx meeting room can ask questions, and then we will also see your video and so on. But it's also possible for people on the live stream to use the chat function and to ask questions, which we will read out later. Yeah, but before, the floor is yours. Eleanor, is she here?
Yes.
Yes, hi. You are going to introduce Ekaterina.
Yes, thank you, Lena, and also a very warm welcome from my side. Yeah, I'm very happy that Ekaterina Chertkovskaya is here with us today. And yeah, just a short introduction to let you know who's going to speak today. Ms. Ekaterina Chertkovskaya is a researcher and project coordinator at the Environmental and Energy System Studies Division at Lund University in Sweden, and she holds a PhD in Management Studies. Her work focuses on degrowth, sustainability, and critical organization studies, with an emphasis on exploring pathways for socio-ecological transformation. She also regularly lectures on these topics at Lund University and other ones in Sweden, but as well internationally. Currently, she's working on a research project called Plastics in a Circular Society, which is devoted to alternative organizing initiatives targeting unsustainable plastic practices. So yes, we're happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Many thanks for the nice introduction, and I'm happy to be here. So thanks for the invitation also. So, and I will, start from here. So basically, this work that I'm presenting to you today, so this is based on a chapter that I have written for a book that Lena is currently editing. So it's titled From Economic Growth to Socio-Ecological Transformation, Rethinking Visions of Economy and Work under SDG 8. And as you can see from the title, the focus is very much SDG 8 in this chapter, and as has been mentioned also in the introduction. So I guess you're all familiar with the Agenda 2030 and have all and are aware of this goal, which is one of the 17 goals within the agenda. So, and it's titled Decent Work and Economic Growth. So, and the the goal is formulated in the following way. Promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. And as it is very obvious from the title of this goal, it is work and the economy that are the key focus of SDG 8, and then the 10 targets within it are devoted to one area or the other, or sometimes both of them. So this is quite interesting in general, that growth is kind of a goal in itself within the Agenda 2030. So together with, for example, addressing climate crisis or fighting hunger and various other goals within the agenda. And also what is quite interesting, that a substantial part of the Agenda 2030 is devoted to environmental issues and several environmental crises, we can say, that are faced by societies today. And then within the Agenda 2030, there is kind of an assumption that economic growth can go together with ecological sustainability. And this is interesting because it marks a shift in the perception of economic growth in governance frameworks. For example, in the 1970s, when the famous Limits to Growth report came out, which was this very remarkable document kind of flagging that economic growth leads to ecological degradation. So there was awareness within governance frameworks that growth leads to degradation of the environment. And the framing was very much around growth versus the environment. But then from the Brundtland report and the 1992 Earth Summits in Rio, we see this shift to thinking about growth as something that can be for the environment, that can come together with ecological sustainability. And this hypothesis, let's say, that growth can be green emerges. And this is very much this latter way of thinking that is present in the Agenda 2030 and in SDG 8 in particular. So what I will do today are three things. So I will problematize SDG 8 and the assumptions behind it. So first, I will problematize the very idea of the perpetual pursuit of economic growth. Then I will problematize the way work kind of is organized in growth-centric economies. And then I will devote some time trying to articulate an alternative understanding of economy and work, because the way SDG 8 is framed from the perspective that I come from, so is very problematic. So then I think that it is important to go beyond growth, let's say, and to articulate alternatives for the economy in different ways, which are not where growth is not central. And that includes for alternatives for work also. So that would be the third part of my talk. And also at the end, maybe we will try to imagine how an alternative to SDG 8 could look. So basically, what I'm going to do is arguing for going from economic growth to socio-ecological transformation within our societies and economies. So, okay, let's start with the problems with the pursuit of economic growth. And this is where a lot of research on a lot of research has been done on this, in particular in degrowth, the area that I very much speak from and that I do my work within. So to start with, the very idea of GDP and perpetual growth is key for SDG 8. So if you look at target 8.1, you can see that the target is to sustain per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances, and in particular at least 7% gross domestic product per annum in the least developed countries. So there is this idea that growth needs to be kind of perpetually happening and at compound rates, so say 7% in the least developed countries. And there are several buts about this, and my presentation today will be very much structured around this, like introducing the target and then all the thinking within SDG 8 and then the buts that I am highlighting. So GDP itself is quite a problematic measure. It's basically a very monetized measure. So for GDP, any economic activity is good. So economic activity that is environmentally destructive is okay for GDP as long as it brings money. And it is a problem when we are dealing with the climate emergency and with the multiple environmental crises. So, and then another problem with GDP is that it kind of downplays some important areas that make up healthy and societies and relations within them. So, for example, what is not commodified and not monetized, such as care, is not included in the GDP. And there is a lot of non-monetized and non-commodified activity that is key for basically the reproduction, the social reproduction of our societies and economies. So then what we see within Target 8.1 is that there is kind of an expectation of a particular rate of economic growth annually, and economists often refer to the figure of 3%, like if let's say the whole globe is taken into account, and somewhere less, somewhere more. But then with this kind of economic growth, what we are expecting is that economy will double in size in 24 years, and then it will increase 16-fold by the end of the century. So also, isn't it some kind of absurd idea that economy has to be growing perpetually at compound rates? So it is absurd if you, so for those of us who speak from degrowth or post-growth perspective, so this kind of perpetual growth is not perhaps needed to ensure good life. So from questioning the concept of GDP and this GDP as a measure of welfare in societies and the very idea that economies should be growing, then there are other problems with this perpetual pursuit of growth. So one is that growth is unsustainable. So in a way it is addressed in SDG 8. So by having the hypothesis that growth can be sustainable and or can become sustainable and become green. So Target 8.4 articulates this, that in a way through global resource efficiency, it is possible, it will be possible to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. So the idea is that it will be possible to have economic growth without environmental pressures that it has been associated with until now. And if you look at the graphs representing growth and environmental pressures since the 1950s, there is work that has become, in a way, classics of that by Stefan and colleagues. So you see that basically growth has been increasing exponentially since then, and so have various environmental pressures such as CO2 emissions, waste, ocean acidification, you name it. So, but then in SDG 8, there is this assumption that it is possible to kind of break the strong connection of growth to environmental degradation by decoupling growth from environmental degradation through global resource efficiency. And there is another big but here. So basically, so far, no empirical evidence, there is no empirical evidence of decoupling of material throughput and environmental pressures from economic growth. So there is some literature that kind of tries to make an argument that decoupling is possible, but none of it looks at the global scale and none of it looks at long-term periods. And basically what we need is this perspective, because if we are to address the global environmental crisis, such as the climate emergency, then it doesn't matter if something has happened in a small space. We need to think globally, and we need to think over long term. To give you an example, many Nordic countries, such as Sweden, where I'm based, have been praised for kind of achieving decoupling. But actually, if you look more deeply into this, you will see that their decoupling has been achieved because there are environmental pressures in other parts of the world. So overall, this biophysical material throughput is rising anyway. So then there is, in the decoupling hypothesis, there is a strong vision for kind of achieving resource efficiency, for developing technologies that would make some breakthroughs that will allow growth without degradation, without ecological degradation. But also, we don't really, there are strong arguments to say that this is a very wishful thinking. So, for example, one important issue to think about are rebound effects associated with resource efficiency. So, for example, some cars can become more efficient and say they consume less fuel than the previous models. But then what happens in an economy oriented towards growth is that more cars are produced and sold on the market, or that consumers might be thinking that their car is so efficient, so they might be willing to drive it more and at higher speeds. So then it means that the kind of efficiency gains in the design of a certain product, then they are kind of taken over by the production, increased production and consumption in relation to this product. So, and this is something that always happens in an economy oriented towards growth. So then there is often an emphasis, well, not often, but in SDG 8, there is actually a particular emphasis on expansion of certain sectors of the economy, such as industry, aviation, tourism, and finance. So in SDG 8, explicitly tourism and finance are mentioned, and then in other SDGs, I think in SDG 9, for example, is the industry that is promoted, and then in relation to the pandemic, when the SDGs have been kind of updated and some discussion was taking place in relation to them, also I could see, for example, an emphasis on aviation in relation to SDG 8. But these are already such problematic and such unsustainable sectors, so then putting an emphasis on their expansion for the future will only bring more unsustainability. So, as many of you must be aware, aviation is very a big contributor to CO2 emissions, and it's not really, there are no technologies that can make it sustainable. So, or industry emissions have been really rising very fast over the past years and decades. So it's very strange for me that the emphasis is put in Agenda 2030 on these unsustainable areas of the economy. So, but then within SDG 8, within the Agenda 2030, and perhaps also within the more general discussion on economies of the future, there is often this emphasis on digital and service economies, that they will be somehow something that brings economic growth, but that they don't need so much materials and energy. But the reality is actually that they do, that digital and service economies are very material, and that to run all sorts of digital infrastructure that we rely on, there is a need for huge data centers. Then there is need for extraction, for rare minerals and things like this. And already the emissions from the ICT sector, for example, are 3.7%. According to the SHIFT project, and they are projected only to keep rising. So also it's hard to kind of say that these are the areas that will allow decoupling to happen. So then when mentioning, for example, extraction in association with fostering digital economies, also this is something that brings me to the point, another point of critique of growth. So not only it is unsustainable, but there are also all sorts of injustices associated with the pursuit of growth. So on the image here, you can see the environmental justice atlas, and perhaps some of you are already familiar with it. So this is an atlas that maps the different environmental conflicts across the world, and of course some areas are kind of mapped more densely, others are not. But you see that there are many conflicts around how growth is pursued, and around how capital is accumulated, and around how development is pursued in various spaces across the world. And these conflicts can be around extraction and around fossil fuels, but also very often around renewable energy and kind of the, let's say, technologies that are often seen as technologies of the future. So, and this is where on the ground, working class communities or indigenous movements are fighting this kind of injustices brought by global capital, often together with the local states and local authorities. So then the point that I would like to briefly make also is that pursuit of growth is unjust. So as I have already mentioned, there are these multiple conflicts across the world. But also if we look, for example, at the high and low income nations, or the so-called global south and global north, there is an unequal exchange between the countries that kind of belong to the different groups, with some spaces, so let's say in the global south, experiencing the a lot of extraction, a lot of environmental pressures, and then also a lot of waste, but then the kind of, let's say, value added from the modern technologies coming to the global capital that is based in different northern states. So, for example, the different high-tech companies based in California, and you can think of many other examples. So then when we think also about societies, in general, across the world, the inequalities have been rising, and there is a huge inequality between different income groups, and also different kind of contribution to unsustainability from them. So, for example, in a study by Oswald and colleagues, they could see that 39% of energy is consumed by the top 10%, and the share of the bottom 10% is only 2%. So this is also something important to think about. And then, of course, the outcomes, the consequences of environmental crisis are often put on the shoulders of also those who are less well off in societies. So, and then also what I think is important in relation to the international governance frameworks is that the emphasis today is very much fighting poverty, and this is also something that is one of the goals within the Agenda 2030. But then in this way, also poverty is kind of positioned as something that contributes to environmental degradation, but it is poverty rather than opulence. So, and in that sense, Gomez, Baguetun, and Naredo make an emphasis that actually opulence or affluence, these are the issues to be addressed, and kind of dealing and putting the responsibility, let's say, on the world's poor or on the working classes for unsustainability is deeply problematic. So basically, now that I have tried to give you a big, let's say, summary of what is problematic with the pursuit of economic growth, and that also it is unsustainable and unjust, I would like to move to work within a growth-centric economy, as this is also something that is the focus of SDG 8. When it comes to work, there is an emphasis on decent work. So, right, the title of SDG 8, it says decent work. So I would like you to see what it means. So here is the definition from the UN. So decent work means opportunities for everyone to get work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development, and social integration. So it does not kind of sound that bad, to put it crudely. So, and perhaps in comparison to economic growth, where this decoupling issue is immediately ringing a bell for me, and something that I can very much immediately problematize based on a lot of research that has been done on the topic, the decent work, I think it has a more kind of subtle framing in SDG 8. So, and many things that are said here in this definition that I have read to you, one cannot disagree with in a way. So, but then here the problem is that what is emphasized under targets in relation to work in SDG 8 is not enough. That would be my argument. So now I'm trying to unpack it for you. So first, what is kind of sidelined, or one can say completely ignored in SDG 8 in relation to work, is that work is actually unsustainable. So it is also a contributor to ecological degradation in growth-focused economies. There has been some work on it, but I think that Hoffman and Paulson have a nice kind of summary of the different factors that contribute to unsustainability of work. This is scale, time, income, and work-induced infrastructure, mobility, consumption. So scale means that basically the more hours worked across the world, the more there is environmental pressures. So basically, hours worked have been connected in various studies to emissions and to other environmental pressures. So then when we spend so much time at work, so that is the second issue, time, and when there is very little time outside work, and there is a lot of also kind of management and efficiency that you need to integrate into your own working life. So there is also maybe an encouragement to consume in ways which are more problematic. So let's say when you have little time, then you will not be you will be buying ready-made foods. You will be buying the kind of food that is already that is industrially produced, and maybe you will not take the time to kind of explore what are the alternatives and how you can consume sustainably and also take the time to do this. So then there is the point of income, and I think it really connects to what I have already mentioned in relation to economic growth. So basically, higher incomes kind of allow to be consuming more and allow for the unsustainable opulence and affluence. And when it comes to work-induced infrastructure, mobility, consumption, so basically the very things, spaces that surround us at work, and the very items that we need to use or processes we need to be part of to be engaged in work, they are also kind of contribute to environmental pressure. So a lot of people commute to work using their cars, right? That's one example, which is very obvious. Or in my own PhD thesis, now a long time ago, I was looking at how actually employers were engaged in branding themselves through opportunities for consumption available for workers. And what I saw when looking at the graduates going through the process of transition from university to work, that many young people were attracted to certain work because of the consumption opportunities that it was promising to provide. So that is another, perhaps less obvious example of work-induced consumption. So basically, yes, there are many issues that make work unsustainable, but also it is important to think that work is not unsustainable in itself. So it is the way it is organized within growth-focused economies. So then in SDG 8, there is also an emphasis on higher productivity and expansion of labor-intensive sectors. And I think there is also some sort of tension or possible contradiction there that is important to speak through. So basically, there is an increased risk of labor-intensive production being substituted by these higher productivity technologies, so such as artificial intelligence. And there is also an increased risk that new kind of high productivity, high value added technologies allow for actually worsening of labor conditions and allow for more spaces for precarity. So let's take the gig economy as an example. So it is very technology mediated way of organizing, let's say, services and delivery of foods as an example. But then as the infrastructure is so central to how this kind of economic space is organized, then the workers who are doing the actual deliveries often face very precarious and very low paid working conditions. And also it is very hard to unionize and organize in order to kind of fight for better rights. So then another issue is that the very emphasis, so if on higher productivity, it's kind of in itself problematic because it can challenge the very quality of work. So think of healthcare. If you come to see a nurse, a doctor, or a midwife, you want them to spend quality time with you, so that there is no rush, and so that they can be kind of a meaningful exchange in this space. But then, for example, if someone's work is organized, that say a nurse needs to see that many people per hour, then the very productivity, so productivity increases, but the quality might be challenged, and is often challenged. So then, again, having spoken about unsustainability of work, about the kind of problems around productivity and work, let me speak a bit about work and injustices. So in SDG 8, this is something that is partially addressed, but the focus is very much on the symptoms rather than the root of the problem, the way I see it. So, for example, there is an emphasis on modern slavery in SDG 8, so under target 8.7, which is important for sure, because many millions of people work still today in these ways. But the problem is that actually modern slavery is often or even most present in sectors that contribute substantially to economic growth. So let's say the area of electronics production, electronics manufacturing is the one that is has very notorious examples like Foxconn, where a lot of people were committing suicides who were working for this company. And then there are other studies that say that even if Foxconn was not like some notorious example, but there are the very way manufacturing is often organized in the electronics sector kind of stimulates this very almost inhumane working conditions. And it's not only Foxconn, let's say, factories that have this problem. Or the mining, which is often associated with this, which is associated with very tough labor conditions and also is addressed in work on modern slavery. So this is also something that is very important for enabling the, let's say, digital economy and the different digital gadgets that are used every day. So there is some sort of contradiction there with addressing modern slavery, but not addressing the structures of growth. So then there is an emphasis on safe and secure work environments, fair wages, and protection of labor rights in SDG 8. And again, this is very important, and I cannot disagree with this, so I totally support this part. But again, it is interesting because actually structurally under neoliberalism, so since at least the 80s, and then there have been different times in different locations for this, work has become more insecure, with kind of job security being substituted by the very idea of employability. So not necessarily having employment, but having the skills which would enable you to find employment, or things like this. So there is a lot more responsibility is put structurally on individuals for their own employment situations, which is very problematic, especially when we face problems like the financial crisis, when a lot of work is simply gone. So then it doesn't matter how employable you are, but then you wouldn't be able to get the job. So, and then it is also interesting and maybe worth mentioning that so despite precariousness and despite insecurity, which is kind of structurally there, also a lot of work lacks meaning and is unsatisfactory for many people around the world. And perhaps you need to be very lucky, privileged, and so this would be the ways to describe it, to love your job and to really be connected and in tune with the work you're doing. Maybe some of you have spotted that as a result of the pandemic, for example, in the US, there is a phenomenon that is described as great resignation. So a lot of people have been leaving their jobs voluntarily also, so because probably they have been finding them unsatisfactory in one way or another. So, and then another issue in relation to work and injustices is that a lot of work that is crucial for the society, and again, something that was very visibilized during the pandemic times, which are still kind of ongoing in some ways. So the work of care workers, of nurses, of teachers, of many, municipal services and so on. So it is very crucial for the society, but it is often not valued adequately, whether in monetary or in social terms. So there is also a problem with kind of which work is supported and which work is valued within our societies. So, and I think that in order to address these structural issues that I have highlighted with work, and in order to address all the problems with the pursuit of economic growth, it is not just some kind of incremental change that is needed. It is not even some transition from, let's say, one source of energy to another is needed, but actually a reorientation of economy and work towards socio-ecological transformation. So my argument is that we need a different economy. So, and SDG 8 puts very much the emphasis on an economy that is centered around growth. And the idea is that growing will result in kind of many social and environmental issues addressed. And as I have argued that this is not the case, then what I would argue for would be a regenerative economy that is focused on sustaining life. So as Stefania Barca would say, on the forces of reproduction instead of production. So, and then it should be focused on kind of well-being and equity, again, rather than growth. And the idea would be to live within the planetary boundaries, and also to ensure that no one is living at someone else's expense. So something that has been called societal boundaries by Ulrich Brandt and colleagues. So because when we are thinking of transforming an economy, it is important to also understand the injustices and inequalities across the world, and not to make sure that, okay, this transformed economy is a prerogative, let's say, of the rich and well-off countries. So, and then the different pressures will still be there with the other countries. So something that, for example, so currently there is this popular discussion on the Green New Deals, and there are various forms and frames for discussing Green New Deal, which is supposed to bring together sustainability and justice. But then often these Green New Deals are kind of done at, say, the national level. So, but if there is some sort of Green New Deal within a European context, then it could also be that this, let's say, justice and sustainability locally is brought at the cost of injustice and environmental pressures in other parts of the world. So thinking from the growth stances and other compatible, let's say, ways of thinking, it is important to address not only the planetary boundaries, but this very idea that no one should be living at someone else's expense. So then it is important to produce not more, but sufficiently and differently, so that human needs are satisfied. And there is a lot of emphasis in the discussion around degrowth and post-growth on kind of human needs satisfaction, rather than in the concept of enough, rather than the idea of more. And then in organizing this regenerative economy, of course, something crucial is the absolute reduction of material and energy throughput. So, because this is what is needed for to live within the planetary boundaries. So then, if we envision work that is organized differently and that is organized also not to foster growth, but to enable these regenerative economies, what would it look like? So, and then I think that here democratized and sustainable would probably be some of the keywords that would describe work. So, and this work would be happening, first of all, in other kinds of economic activities. So going away from fossil dependency of fossil fuels, work focused more on repairing and reusing rather than producing in ways that's producing to be wasted, let's say, or plant production with plant obsolescence in design, as is something that is happening today. So then it is important to value in social terms and visibilize work that is focused on care for people and environments, because this is something key for enabling, again, regenerative economies. And a lot of this small scale and labor intensive production can be encouraged, because this is the kind of production that can be organized in more, let's say, democratic and ecologically sustainable ways. And there are already many examples of alternatives that are doing things differently, but the problem is that these alternatives are often on the margins. So, for example, the peasants united in Via Campesina network, or the kind of local farmers that organize the production so that then they directly sell to the people living in the areas where they produce, zero waste stores, and many, many other examples kind of give you a hint of how work and production can be done sustainably and democratically at the same time. So then just labor relations is something key also to emphasize, because in democracy at work, this is something that connects to the meaning from work and to the kind of satisfaction that one gets from work. So, and now to kind of, as I'm nearing the end of my talk, having presented you the critiques of economic growth and work and the way they are the way they are kind of pursued within SDG 8, and having talked through an alternative and how an alternative economy and alternative way of organizing work could look like. Now let's think, okay, is an alternative to SDG 8 even possible? And here I'm kind of also thinking, so it's not something that I have given a lot of deep thinking, but let's try to re-envision what it would be like. So first of all, if talking about an alternative to SDG 8, I would even change the very frame. So to change the frame from Sustainable Development Goals to Sustainable Wellbeing Goals, because development is also a concept that is very tightly connected to growth and all the problems that I have identified with it. So well-being seems to me a better kind of focal point, let's say. So then this very new frame would be informed not by these linear ideas of growth, development, industrialization, and so on, but it would be informed by different knowledges coming from different spaces of the world, and the different knowledges that help to understand and build well-being beyond growth, development, and capitalism. So these alternatives and alternative knowledges are often discussed under the concept of pluriverse. There is a nice book on pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, it's called, which kind of gives a great map of these ways of thinking beyond growth, development, and capitalism. So then this SWG 8 that is devoted to work and economy, I would probably frame it as something like regenerative economy, democratized and sustainable work. And maybe a way to kind of formulate this goal would be to reorganize or organize economies and work to ensure well-being for all within planetary and societal boundaries. And also, as this is something that I haven't given very thorough thought, but there could be the different, as SDG 8 has these different targets, then perhaps there could also be several directions for targets for SWG 8. So this could be around reducing ecologically and socially harmful activities, for example, the absolute reduction of biophysical throughput and the phase out of harmful economic activities and work. Then some of the targets could be devoted to organizing economies differently, so refocusing the economy on regenerative activities, focusing on needs satisfaction, and perhaps also thinking through what amount of economic activity is needed to satisfy those needs and to ensure the well-being for all. So, and then also kind of this reorganization of economies should be thought through with the relations between and across countries in mind. So kind of how to ensure that relations are equitable and that we have equal rather than unequal exchange. So when it comes to reorganizing work, then this is where work should be also kind of directed towards regenerative economy, and where perhaps subsistence should be independent from paid labor, because currently our lives are so dependent on the paid labor that we have. So kind of breaking that connection would be important. Then reducing the overall amount of work is also something that would be a direction for the targets for SWG 8. And then promotion of work on democratic grounds and promotion of kind of alternative forms of organizing, where democracy within the workplace is more, let's say, organic, is also something that I would consider. So yes, and I would like to finish on this note. I hope it gives you food for thought, and I very much look forward to having a discussion with you around these issues. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your interesting lecture, Dr. Chertkovskaya. Then let's just move on to the Q&A session. So please, anybody who wants a question, click the hand up button firstly, then I will call your name. Okay. Yeah, okay. Maren Lorenz Fischer, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your time and your talk. It was really insightful. And I have a question regarding the degrowth concept, because you mentioned in your manuscript that degrowth stems from a European context and that there are other alternative concepts to development that are similar, such as when we veer and the ecological soirée. Yeah. And I was wondering what the differences between these two concepts and degrowth are, and why you have chosen the European degrowth concept for your analysis instead of the Latin American or Indian one.
Thanks a lot for the question. Should I go ahead with answering it, right? Yeah. So I would say maybe I can start with myself. So I have been working in my thesis almost 10 years ago on kind of critiques of employability, critiques of work, and I could see that there was something wrong with economic growth, but it's not. I didn't have a frame at the time to addressing it. So and then since then I was interested to kind of channel my research that also connects to activism and that connects to not only problematizing what's happening and what's wrong in the world, but also try to look for alternatives. And this is how I came across degrowth. And there was a conference, wonderful conference on degrowth in Leipzig in 2014, which I attended. And then I could see, okay, that really speaks to me a lot, because in my work, I could see how growth, kind of pursuit of growth in the economy in the UK context was something that also was important for really changing to the worse the education within the universities, and introducing all sorts of neoliberal measures around education that shifted it somewhere else, let's say, from the ideals of education. So, and then in many other cases, I could see that, okay, there is something with growth, and the growth was a way for me to see, to reconcile the problems with the alternatives, and maybe speaking from the European Western context, this was something that I could very much intuitively connect to. And let's say it was a powerful way to describe the problems that I was myself seeing, researching, and grappling with. So in that sense, kind of the concepts that I learned about later, such as when we veer or ecological swaraj or others, then they, so it's not that I can speak about them because they come from a different context, and even if I think they can be used also to, or drawn on to inform some of the things that we might not be seeing from a degrowth perspective. So, and then also I have been writing myself in relation to the Russian and kind of post-Soviet context, because this is where my background is, and that's where I originally come from. So I was thinking, okay, how does degrowth thinking connect to this like context, which is which is not the same, let's say, as the Western Europe, but also it cannot be seen as the global South. And then in my work, I argue that actually there has been a lot of pursuit of growth in the Soviet Union, and also there is a kind of legacy of the Soviet Union in promoting this massive industrialization and something with what we're dealing with the consequences of which we're dealing today. So for that context, I think degrowth also speaks, even if there are concepts from the thought connected to the Soviet or even pre-Soviet, let's say, contexts, that can also be used to describe the problems with pursuit of growth and with pursuit of capitalism. So, and then also, what is the difference, you ask, between the concepts? I think there is an article by Ashish Kothari and colleagues from 2014 or 2015, where they frame it nicely, and they say that all these different concepts, they kind of share the characteristics. So they have a shared understanding, let's say, of what is wrong. So they do see these problems with the pursuit of growth, with the development, and with this linear way of thinking that more is always better, and development is the only way for societies to, let's say, go into the future. And all these concepts problematize this linear way of thinking. But then the worldviews that they have are kind of different and rooted also in different ways of thinking. So let's say degrowth is an answer in many ways to the consequences of pursuit of growth in industrialized countries. But then other concepts, they can have more the rootedness in the traditions of a particular space and of the indigenous cultures, let's say. So then this is not a response necessarily to growth, but they are rooted somewhere else, but they also have to respond to the violent, often pursuit of growth and development. So, and then also this kind of very idea of pluriverse that many of these concepts are united under. So it is a world where many worlds fit. So there are many different ways of thinking that these concepts kind of embody, but they are in dialogue and they are compatible with each other. But also it is important, let's say, to keep reflecting, okay, how do we think of degrowth as, like, if this is the concept that you connect with, as is the case for me, but how do we speak and let's say elaborate degrowth ideas in ways which are decolonial and that do not close other ways of thinking and that don't prioritize a particular direction. So yeah, I hope that addresses your question.
Okay, thank you. Then, Feru, would you please make a question next?
Yes, actually, my question already got answered during the presentation, so it's fine. Thanks anyway.
Right. Okay, then Arthur, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the lecture. I like the normative stand that you took and the criticism of growth and development. But we were wondering about you talk about the need to reduce working time and the arguments for degrowth. And we were thinking about what this means for the global South, where there is a new generation of young people wanting to eagerly wanting to work, and how do you sell to these people that they should actually work less and should be happy that there's little work? So how do you sell the concept of degrowth to developing nations and people in developing nations? Thank you.
Thank you. So I would say here that yeah, so probably there is no need to sell the concept of degrowth, let's say, to the spaces where other concepts exist. So because, say, I don't know, Latin America, yes, so there would be the strong movements locally, the concept of buen vivir that speaks more to this context. Or in Brazil, there is also strong kind of movement of indigenous people who are fighting a lot the extractivism, including in association with renewable energy, and they would also have their kind of world views that problematize growth, but it's not that. So they are in a way doing already what degrowth is speaking about. So, and hence there is a big also discussion connecting environmental justice and degrowth. So there are this many struggles that are identified on the Environmental Justice Atlas. So they are very much embodying, let's say, well, the struggle against development and growth, and often different worldviews that come with them. So in that sense, degrowth perhaps articulates something that is already there, and there is no need to say that everyone has to kind of sign up for degrowth as the frame. So pluriverse is a very good, I think, kind of umbrella term to bring everyone together. So then when it comes to working time, I think that's, yeah, your question points to maybe some issues or some contradictions that we are still to think about within the degrowth scholarship and movement, because and I can't immediately come up with studies of working time in connection to spaces in the global south, but you can say that. So I don't know that there are definitely, let's say, a lot of people who want to work necessarily more. So, but I could think that, okay, maybe it is important to see that there would be different also social groups, different classes with different priorities. So there could be the, let's say, middle class of relatively privileged people within a context, let's say, like the Brazilian, where people may be aspiring for the kinds of jobs that are promoted by these big multinational corporations, which I used to study and which I also mentioned to you in the presentation. So then here, like, there could be people aspiring for more working time, but there are also people who are already working a lot, perhaps of different social groups, and maybe they would be aspiring for something else. So I'm not sure I kind of can have a very clear-cut answer to you on this, but I would say that, okay, it depends on the group that we are talking to, and perhaps I would think intuitively that there would be many people who are overworked and already work a lot. But then for those who are, let's say, somewhat enjoying the higher working hours and the consumption opportunities that come with it, so it is important to think, okay, how do we speak to these groups of people also in a way that makes the argument for going beyond growth and development plausible. And it could be highlighting the environmental side of the question, that this is something that is very present already, and something that many people across the world are already suffering through, but also it will be more and more so in the future. So it could be through kind of highlighting this maybe issues with work, like what our work contributes to. So even if someone can be, I don't know, excited to be a financial consultant somewhere, but then if their work contributes to actually subsidizing petrochemical industry and contributing to more emissions, then perhaps you could also come through that. So how working more in work that actually is destructive is problematic, and probably a lot of people would also understand that. But I don't have kind of all the answers for you there, so that's also something for many of us to think about together.
You. Just quickly for the people who are watching from the live stream, there's a Q&A button on the left-hand side on the bottom, so you can ask questions there and I will read them out loud here in the session. Thank you.
Okay, then Maike, please.
Yes, thank you. And also thank you for this very insightful and interesting lecture. My question also regards the Global South. You have criticized, and I think I could really well follow your critique about growth and a growth-centered economy, but also the concept of development. So I was wondering how for example, the goal that is also enshrined in the SDGs of providing more people with access to energy relates to your critique of development, because there are so many SDGs that really center around development. And you've also mentioned that in an ideal world, you would want to substitute development with well-being. But then how does this relate to, for energy or to hygiene or infrastructure, for example?
Thank you. So you were cut, at least from my side, at the end. So, but I understand that you would like to connect what I have been talking about, so the critique of growth, to also the critique of development and other SDGs were where development is quite central. So like building the infrastructure. Did I understand it right?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. So so I would say that a lot of the discussion on degrowth, it kind of stems also from the discussion around critiques of development. So, I mean, there are many voices, let's say, that make up the degrowth discussion, and I think that's wonderful. There is also not like a single author that is the only authority, the main authority. But in the 2000s, when this discussion was starting, the work of Serge Latouche was quite influential. And then I think that he was speaking from the kind of critiques of development and then applying this to broader thinking about also how to change the economy and society in the European context. So this kind of discussion of alternatives to development and degrowth, it has been kind of going hand in hand depending on which area you come from into the degrowth discussion. Or, for example, when it comes to the area of political ecology, where a lot of the work is devoted on environmental justice issues in the global south, then also you can see how actually the development often comes with violence. So with dispossession and what this kind of conflicts powerfully point to, let's say. So, and in that sense also degrowth scholars and activists, we point to spaces like the Environmental Justice Atlas to show that, okay, I mean, it maps conflicts in different parts of the world, but if you look at the global south, so probably like many or most conflicts there would be associated with how development is pursued. So in that sense, growth and development are very much part of the same coin. And then within the degrowth discussion, you problematize both growth and development, but as degrowth cannot be, so it's not possible to say that, okay, degrowth applies to any context, then it is important to look at the discussion on alternatives to development. But then I think what also your question brings up is that, okay, how to think of infrastructure, let's say. So, and you can say, okay, many places in the global south would need the infrastructure that would provide, the basic needs for people living there or something like this. And I think here it's kind of, a key point of maybe discussion. And some scholars, even within the degrowth area, would be saying, okay, actually, we speak first of all about degrowth within the European or global north spaces, but then the global south, there are space, maybe they can be growing. It's not our, let's say, it's not our business. So it can be, something else can be happening there. And we speak from this privileged, over industrialized west or north. But then some other scholars, and probably I would connect more to this discussion, would say that, what is happening within the global south and in the name of growth and in the name of development is also problematic. And then when we think of infrastructure that enables something important in a let's say developing or global south context, then also maybe what would be key is to say, what is this infrastructure for? So is it something environmentally destructive or wasteful, where the elites, maybe the state authorities benefit, but then many others are dispossessed from their lands and have to work in this problematic jobs and there will be growth, but at the same time together with dispossession and other problems? Or is there some infrastructure that is actually needed and that is made not for growth, but for this for well-being and need satisfaction? So I think that's, yeah, it really is important to think like of concrete contexts and examples, but then I would always ask the question, what is it for? So it's not that we always need more infrastructure, but in some context, infrastructure is needed, and if this brings some kind of economic growth as a result of it in a particular context, that's fine. So degrowth is not, I think it's important to stress it, and maybe I haven't stressed it enough in this talk. So degrowth is not about like, okay, it's not about reducing economic growth. So it's about going away from growth-centric thinking and reducing biophysical throughput, so the use of energy and materials, but we are aware as degrowthers that as a result of this economic reshaping, we will not have the kind of economic growth that has been experienced and that is wanted within SDGs. But it can be happening. But it's the question is, okay, what for would a particular economic expansion be? So yeah, sorry if it's a bit on the abstract level, but then I hope that maybe you can connect yourselves to some of the examples that you may have been reading and thinking about in your program and beyond.
All right, and I think Laura should take first, and next, Jana.
Yes, we have a question from the live stream from Felix. He wants to know what role the universal basic income plays in your model of reducing work in general.
Thank you for this question. So that's another interesting kind of direction for discussion. And I would say that overall within degrowth, universal basic income does come up quite a bit, because this is, so the most attractive part about it is that this is a way to kind of ensure one's living and one's subsistence without disconnectedness to work. And in a way going away also from work being so central in our lives, and maybe then creating the more meaningful and doing more meaningful work in societies. So basic income has this important quality, let's say, for going away from the centrality of work and being able to do the things that we really find important. So then I think that with the discussion of the basic income, the devil is in the details, because it is something that can be so seen as interesting from the growth stances, from some other stances, but also, for example, the very neoliberal thinkers have been kind of stressing that basic income could be a good idea. So like I think both Friedman and Hayek had some kind of positive vision of basic income. And in that sense, we should also look at the possible dangers of how basic income can be implemented, because maybe there is some sort of basic income that takes away the bureaucracies associated with the state, and then employers can be more kind of flexible to hire and fire people, because they would know, okay, even if we really fire our employees, they will survive because there is this basic income. So there is kind of space for making work even more precarious, and then also channeling it more towards employers rather than towards the employees, let's say. So then also with the basic income, an important question is what it enables. And some maybe reservation around it could be that, okay, it could be that there is a basic income and then it is given in the currency of the state, for example, where one lives, and then it will be spent on unsustainable consumption, so, or on kind of problematic things. And then there are some ideas around basic income that try to go away from this. So Alf Hornborg, for example, who is based at Lund, also he has this idea of basic income that would be distributed in local currency. So something that kind of supports one's basic needs, let's say, but also so that this income can be used for within the local economy. So, for example, for local production or to pay the rent or things like this. And I think that's an interesting direction for thinking about basic income, because that tries to kind of reconcile the idea of basic income with also, let's say, ecological sustainability. And then also with basic income, another interesting issue or problem is that the spaces where it has been tried, so such as Finland, it kind of often the very design of the basic income, it is done in a way that the whole experiment somehow fails. So, for example, the sum that is given to people is so small that actually you can't live on this sum of money. So in that sense, if the difference so if this is the design of the basic income, it wouldn't really help to liberate you from work that you don't want to be doing. And finally, I think what is important to think about is also, again, this how basic income comes in. So does it come to substitute some of the, let's say, welfare provisions that the state already has, or does it come together with them? And I think in spaces where there is relatively generous welfare provision by the state, there is often this fear that the basic income would take away this. So in spaces like Sweden, that would be one of the issues of kind of thinking that basic income is problematic, because there are some or quite some welfare provisions that kind of support one if they are in situations of need, precarity, and insecurity. So design, I think, is a key question, but overall, I think that definitely it is something that would be part of degrowth thinking and thinking in relation to work in particular. And maybe also this discussion comes together with the concept of universal basic services, which is something different, right? Which is about a level of services that one gets, but it is then non-monetary, so it's not connected to money, but also satisfies some basic needs of a person. And then there is a concept which is discussed in France, I think, which is called universal autonomy allowance, which is kind of not connected to basic income, but is not exactly the same. So I think it's around this anyway, that an ideal for the future of work would be connected to a combination of this.
Thank you. Then Jana Paya, please.
Thank you very much for the interesting lecture also from my side. You explained very clearly how the United Nations, through, for example, SDG 8, sees economic growth as a universal goal, even related to sustainable development. And my question would be if you think that the international institutions like the United Nations or even the OECD would ever support degrowth, or if we need, or if these organizations need to be overcome altogether because of their focus on growth, and we need kind of new degrowth institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's another very big, important and wonderful question. So in the sense that in the degrowth thinking, we say that, I mean, when we look for alternatives that are already out there, we identify the kind of various bottom-up, let's say, initiatives, organizations, movements, because we say that these are the ones that already embody what degrowth is about in one way or another, even if they don't call themselves degrowth necessarily. So, but then they are kind of fragile and maybe not visible and not supported by the institutions of society today. And then the question is, okay, what do we do? And then within the degrowth discussion, there is generally kind of we're not shying away, let's say, from the idea that we should try to change the institutions of society. And there are also probably different voices on to what extent that can be possible or not. But there is work that argues that states currently are promoting growth, but there is space for them to be doing something differently, and there is a role for the state in socio-ecological transformation. But and when it comes to international organizations, that would also be kind of a connected discussion, in the sense that, yes, of course, institutions such as the OECD have been the spaces through which growth was kind of, or this idea, of growth has become central within societies. So, but at the same time, they are the spaces which like have different dynamics, let's say, that is going on. And then if you read the work of Matthias Schmelzer, who has written on OECD and how the paradigm of growth came about, but also he has written on how the very ideas of the limits to growth also come through the networks within the OECD. So the Limits to Growth report that was written by the Club of Rome, so many of the authors there, they kind of were very connected to the OECD, and they were these different voices within the OECD who were pushing, let's say, a different discussion, which is very relevant still today, and which unfortunately hasn't shaped or reshaped OECD, but also it does connect to those spaces. So, or I think that more recently there was some report within OECD, something beyond growth and so on. So in that sense, I wouldn't maybe put hope, let's say, that, okay, these are the institutions that would be so enlightened that they would change our thinking about growth. But probably I would also not completely discharge them as impossible to change, because they have kind of complex internal dynamics, and where possible, it is important to try and push them towards something else. So say within the European Parliament, there was a discussion on post-growth organized several years ago, pushed by also degrowth groups, among others. And it was so different from the at the level of criticality from what we have, let's say, in the degrowth movement, but it was there at least. And I mean, has not changed much so far, but such attempts need to be happening. So, or sometimes it could be that certain international institutions, like connected, well, maybe I can give you an example. So in Sweden, there is this area that is interesting for mining in the north. And recently, there were some experts connected to UNESCO that were kind of speaking against this mining. And even if it was not the position of UNESCO itself, but these were the experts connected to UNESCO, then it gives somehow a bit more credibility, let's say, to these voices, or it gives some status to these voices and recognitions that can, then these voices can join forces with the movements that are fighting against this mining expansion. So I think that, yeah, it's important to take these spaces as those with complex dynamics and think how to change them. But if there is a way to create alternative institutions, I think we should go for that too also.
Thank you. Then, is there any other question? Nobody.
Yeah, I think that's perfect because we are close to the end. So thank you very much, Ekaterina. Thanks, Wen Yang, for moderating the session. Yeah, so what I take away is that obviously the SDGs are often, although they are often considered an agenda for the Global South, they also concern the Global North. And this is also the idea behind them, that different from the previous MDGs, they do not only apply to the Global South, but they also concern the Global North with all benefits and pitfalls. And it's important that we discuss these pitfalls too, of like what these goals actually imply. And yeah, and it's good to see that there's already a discussion on alternatives. And as a researcher, I say, okay, we need more research on the alternatives. But of course, we do not only need research, but sometime soon we also need to implement some of these alternatives. So thank you so much, Ekaterina, for pushing the debates and for working together with activists too. We really appreciate this kind of research. So thank you so much, and maybe we have this new tradition that we take a picture with all people involved. So maybe we can still do this, but let's first perhaps say goodbye to the live stream, and that people who are still in the meeting can join. Okay, thank you, Ekaterina.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks a lot.